Thanks, Ed. Good morning, everybody. Glad to see you here this morning. My name is Lou Hebert, and I'm going to be presenting the service today along with Phil Park-Thomas. And Kevin McClooney, Colleen Fitzgerald, Megan Rancier, and Steve Israel are providing technical assistance today. And Ted Goldman is our music director. Please be aware that we are recording this service, and it is posted on a YouTube page. For privacy, we do not record during joys and concerns. And at the end of the service, after we extinguish the chalice, we will have announcements then. So we joined together this morning to seek justice, equality, and fairness in the world. Our hearts are touched by the human need we feel around us. Whether far away or within reach of our hands, we come here to be together because this is how we believe and how we believe our lives are best lived, in questioning, in conversation, in compassion, and in service, in gratitude and joy, in companionship and in love. It is good to be together with all of you this morning. If this is your first service here at MVUUC, please note we are a diverse group with varying interests and beliefs. And our services are varied in format, tone, and topic, and we encourage you to attend or view several services to gain a good understanding of our congregation here. If you'd like to receive our weekly email newsletter, please fill out a blue information card. You can find those in the pockets on the back of the chairs, and leave your card in the front greeting table. Please take a moment to say hello and good morning to those who are seated around you. Okay. The chalice today is going to be lit by Megan Rancier. Please join us in reading these words for the lighting of the chalice. For our Zoom attendees, they appear in the comment in the chat box. Yesterday, our distant ancestors gathered round a flame to share their stories and find comfort. Okay. Okay. All right, we'll start again. Yesterday, distant ancestors gathered around a flame to share their stories and find comfort. Tomorrow, we'll gather around a flame and talk of a life that we will never know. Today, it is we who gather here in this flame, seeking, believing, and being together. Thanks, Lynn. And now, I'm going to turn things over to Ted.
We've got a really simple hymn today. The words, I think, probably, yep, there they are. You can read them from over there. Okay. I'm happy to see some new faces in the audience. I'll just mention to anybody who hasn't been here before, we don't care if you sing in tune. We just like to hear your voice along with us. No one wants to sing alone, so the more sounds we can make, the more everybody feels okay about making noise themselves. This is a simple one. I'll just sing it once so you can hear how it goes, and you can follow along with the words, and then you'll come in with me. It goes, Ancient Mother, I hear you calling. Ancient Mother, I hear your song. Ancient mother, I feel your laughter. Ancient mother, I taste your tears. Ancient mother, I hear you calling. Ancient mother, I hear your song. Ancient mother, I feel your laughter. Ancient mother, I hear your tears. Keep going. Ancient mother, I hear you calling. Ancient mother, I hear your song. Ancient mother, I feel your laughter. Ancient mother, I taste your tears. Ancient mother, I hear you calling. Ancient mother, I hear your song. Ancient mother, I feel your laughter. Ancient mother, I taste your tears. Ancient mother, I hear you calling. Ancient mother, I hear your song. Ancient mother, I feel your laughter. Ancient mother, I taste your tears. Humming. And now let's sing our kids out. Go now in peace, go now in peace. May the spirit of love surround you everywhere, everywhere you may go.
Thanks, Ted. For our opening words today, Lynn Israel is going to lead a responsive reading provided by our guest speaker.
Every part of the earth is sacred.
Every shining pine needle, every drop of water in flowing streams, even the mist that drifts through wooded lands, every meadow and humming insect is sacred, part of the web that binds all life together.
The rocky hill and grassy vale, the animals and all creatures of the wing, the fish and denizens beneath the waters, and all people are one family. Teach your children that the earth is our mother.
Whatever wounds the earth wounds all of us. We are part of the earth, and she is part of us.
Care for the waters, for the rivers that are our brothers.
Care to breathe in growing veins, for they are our
This is the great wisdom. This is the great truth.
The earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth.
Whatever we do to the web of life, we do to ourselves.
Let us walk with humility, honoring the earth, for we are in one circle, all peoples and all creatures. The ground we walk is a sacred sanctuary, and our respect for the earth and our love for one another is all we have. Let it be so.
And now we'd like to welcome Phil Park Thomas to our podium.
Well, good morning, and it is certainly an honor to be here with you, or I might say to you, Osio Dohiju, your response would be, Osta. Now I can throw one at you and ask, Jalagiasi Suwaniha? Which I'm sure your answer would be Tla Tla, if you knew what I said. I just asked if any of you speak Cherokee, and the response, of course, was no. It is, as I said before, it is an honor to be here with you this morning and to share with you. What I'm going to present to you is a condensation of a much larger three-part workshop that I do from time to time on Native American law and history. And we don't often think of Native American communities in the context in which I'm going to present to you. But first slide, please. Our story begins in London, Ontario. And as the name suggests, and the name of the nearby river, which happens to be the Thames, suggests, this was settled as an English settlement. And by the year 1900, it was a thriving city, fairly modern for its time, about 38,000 people, give or take a few. Most of its residents were English, Irish, Scottish, some Cornish, mostly people from the British Isles, and very small percentage, I'm not sure, from other European countries, or at least descended from. London, Ontario didn't have much interactions with the neighboring indigenous peoples. It was very insular. It tended to interact with other European-founded communities in Ontario, like Toronto or Windsor, which really wasn't that very far away. John Northcott was a English-descended businessman. His father actually had moved to Ontario from Western England, and he was building his own career up in the city of London. And at a certain time in his 20s, late 20s, he left London for a time to conduct business elsewhere. When he returned to London, he was a married man. And he brought with him a bride who was a stunning brunette, and her complexion was just a little bit darker. She obviously wasn't of English descent, but they said nothing about where she came from. Rumors started to go around in their social circle that she was from perhaps Spain, or perhaps her ancestry was Spanish. There weren't too many Spanish people living in Ontario at that time, particularly that part of Ontario, so they didn't have a whole lot to compare her to. And John Northcott, and her name was Isabel, let the fiction stand as it was. She became known as the Spanish Woman of London, Ontario. Only she wasn't Spanish. You see, in Ontario at that time, as in many parts of North America, people of indigenous background were subject to discrimination. And in fact, it was, even though sometimes we think of Canada treating its First Nations people a little bit better than the United States, they really have their own troubled history. And it was possible for a white man to lose business contacts, to be shunned if he was married to a non-white woman. Didn't matter what her background was, but it was also scandalous if she was native. Isabel came from the Huron and Ojibwe peoples of Ontario. And in fact, barely 30 miles away from London, Ontario, was one of the First Nation reserves. But people of London had very little contact with indigenous people, and she spoke flawless English, as many First Nations people in Ontario had learned to do. But the price that she paid was that she had to keep her real identity, her real heritage, and her real background undercover. She never could invite her own family up to visit her at their home in London, lest they be seen. Their own tribal dress was a little bit different. The clothing was a little bit different than the surrounding communities. They would have stuck out. Not that they wore breechcloths and all that stuff you see in the Westerns. They were cloth clothing, but the pattern was different. And she conducted herself as a proper, upper middle class woman of London, Ontario, to the day that she died. But the price she paid was that she had to live somewhat in secret. Stories like this are common all over North America, both in Canada and in the United States. And our relationship with the indigenous people, the people who were here before, is a complicated history. There isn't time to go into all of it here. Like I said, I give a longer 3-part workshop on many of these issues. Next slide, please. Our story goes back in the Americas, and this is all the Americas, United States included, to this man, Pope Alexander VI, who in 1493 had heard the stories brought back by Columbus and his crew of the lands that they had found in what we call the Caribbean now. And Pope Alexander issued a papal bull in 1493 that has come to be called the Doctrine of Discovery. It said, in essence, any lands not inhabited by Christians is available for discovery, conquest, domination by Christian nations. And the people living therein are subject to conversion, rule, and exploitation. This is a summary, a paraphrase of the much longer document, the much longer papal bull. And it was this papal bull that inspired the European nations to engage in the next few centuries in competitive exploration and conquest of the Americas. First Spain, followed by Portugal, followed by France, followed by England and Holland at the same time. And one of the strange things about this legacy of the doctrine of discovery, it was adopted by the Protestant nations of England and Holland, which in itself is a complicated story. But this whole era of exploration that followed in the 1500s and the 1600s and the early 1700s goes back to this document. If the Pope had not responded in this way to the stories that he heard about Columbus, Western history might have been very different. But at this time, papal decrees still carried a great deal of weight. Next slide. Of course, the question comes, who discovered who and who discovered what? Because when Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, the lands that he came to, the islands that he came to, had already been inhabited for centuries. The local residents certainly didn't feel that they were discovered. And there is some question as to whether Columbus himself may have made some navigational errors that put him in the Caribbean. So maybe the locals discovered a lost European. The cartoon you see up here is by Ricardo Cates, who is a Pueblo cartoonist living in New Mexico. Thought I'd share a little native humor, and you can read the cartoon for yourself. The doctrine of discovery, though, has had a tremendous impact even on U.S. history. And in fact, it is enshrined in U.S. law. Next slide. A man by the name of James Johnson had gone out into the Northwest Territory area that is now southern Illinois. And between 1773 and 1775, purchased land from some of the local tribes and built his homestead there. By the early 19th century, that part of the country now was considered under the jurisdiction of the United States, which was just born, and shortly after he bought this property. And I don't remember exactly how many acres he bought, but this was his homestead, and he intended to pass it on to his heirs. He died in the early 19th century, and his heirs claimed that property as their own, as their inheritance. But the United States government claimed jurisdiction over what is now Illinois, and was selling land under its jurisdiction for settlement. And he sold it to someone by the last name of, sometimes you see it spelled as McIntosh, and sometimes you see it spelled as Emmentosh. And in the court records, it's recorded as Emmentosh. Emmentosh went down and discovered there already was a homestead sitting on his property. And he wanted to build his homestead there. But the Johnsons said no. So they took him to court. Went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. And in 1823, and this was the Marshall Court, ruled in Johnson v. Emmentosh that the property belonged properly to the Emmentosh family, not the Johnsons, who already had a homestead there. What was the Supreme Court's reasoning? They cited the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine that you just saw, put out by Pope Alexander VI several centuries before already. And they said that since the United States had inherited this country from the United Kingdom, that all laws and property transfers that were not already deeded properly under the laws of the United Kingdom were automatically transferred to the United States government, the United States government then being the inheritors of the doctrine of discovery had the right to pass on this land to Emmentosh. Well, this had a tremendous impact on what is to become the relationship between the United States federal government and the various tribes. Already in the United States Constitution, in Article 1, Section 8, it gives the United States Congress the right to transact business between foreign nations and the various Indian tribes. That language is actually in the United States Constitution. It's called the Commerce Clause. And so that Commerce Clause, plus the doctrine of discovery, cited now by the United States Supreme Court, is firmly embedded and influences the relationship between the United States federal government and the tribes for the next several centuries. And it is a rocky road. Next slide, please. It leads to the United States government deciding in 1830 to pass what is called the Indian Removal Act. Now, the Indian Removal Act states that the 5 civilized tribes, and that is a rather insulting term to insinuate that other tribes are not, but as I will give you a list of those in a moment of what they were. These were the tribes living primarily in the southeastern United States at the time, that the United States government could offer them compensation to leave their lands and to move west to designated territory on the other side of the Mississippi. This would be the Indian Territory. This becomes the state of Oklahoma in 1907. And technically, Oklahoma begins as a massive reservation. But the tribes were not all enthusiastic about moving. And the largest of these tribes, next slide, next click, please, was the Cherokee Nation. And the state of Georgia wanted the Cherokee to move. They particularly had an incentive when gold was discovered on Cherokee land. And the Georgians wanted to be able to claim that, but the Cherokee said, no, this is our land, this is our property, stay off. Georgia said, your land is in our state. Well, so what happened is that the Cherokee Nation under Chief John Ross went to the United States Supreme Court and sued the state of Georgia. 1831, year after the Indian Removal Act, the Supreme Court hears this case, and who do you think won? Any guesses? Pardon? The Cherokee Nation. In a surprise move, the Marshall Court said Georgia had no business trying to tell the Cherokee to move. If the Cherokee didn't want to move, did not want to accept compensation under the Indian Removal Act, they could stay. Well, Georgia wasn't done. So Georgia decided to pass a law that would prohibit non-Cherokee from teaching, running businesses, and doing any kind of work in the Cherokee Nation, including missionaries, without a license from the state government. Now, can you imagine today if, well, maybe with the way in which we have this with Christian nationalism, we're not far from it, but can you imagine today if some missionary organization wanted to operate in Ohio and they went to the Ohio legislature to get a license for that? But that's what Georgia wanted to impose on the Cherokee Nation. They were trying to make it hard for the Cherokee to conduct business. It so happened that there was a missionary, Congregationalist missionary, who, by the way, had been raised in the Unitarian Church in New England, was working in the Cherokee Nation, and he was working to open schools and was helping the Cherokee children to learn their syllabary, that's their alphabet, which had been created by Sequoyah in the early 1820s. The Cherokee had a written language, and Samuel Worcester had learned how to teach this language to the children. He was doing them a favor. He was not necessarily indulging in a lot of religious indoctrination. Part of his missionary work was the work of education. When Georgia said, no, you don't have a license. And so they went in and they arrested Worcester and threw him in prison. So the Cherokee Nation went back to the Supreme Court and said, this man is illegally imprisoned by the state of Georgia. Supreme Court heard their case in Worcester v. Georgia, and who do you think won this case? The Cherokee Nation again. Twice, the Cherokee Nation, and realized that at this time, the Cherokee were not regarded as citizens of the United States. They considered themselves, they knew the United States Constitution well enough to go to the Supreme Court. They had done their homework. They knew that they had a certain standing as one of the various Indian tribes, and that technically they were a foreign nation. And yet, the United States government was not sending an ambassador or a delegation to them. And so, after a long struggle, next click, the United States government finally loses its patience with the Cherokee who were fighting to remain on their land and sends in the United States Army to forcibly evict them. And this is the beginning of the Trail of Tears, in which the majority of the Cherokee who could not flee into the hollers, as they call them, of the Smoky Mountains, were forcibly evicted to go west. And the Trail of Tears is various routes. It wasn't all the same route, but they all ended up in what was the Indian Territory. About a quarter of their elderly and about a quarter of their children of the age of 8 and under died while in transit. While they were moved west, many of them had to camp outdoors without shelter, under guard by the United States Army, and were subject to disease and a terrible loss. This is why it is called the Trail of Tears. It is not the only Trail of Tears. Next slide, please. Here are the tribes that were removed in their order under the Removal Act. Click 1, the Choctaw. Click 2, the Chickasaw. Click 3, the Muscogee, the Creek, same tribe. The Seminole, who are those who are unable to flee into the Everglades to avoid forced deportation. So the Seminole used to live in most of Florida, and they were forcibly removed. This is part of the story we don't get to hear very often. And finally, click the Cherokee, the largest tribe to be forcibly moved. Next slide, please. But the Indian removals continued. It wasn't just these 5 tribes. Once the United States government had discovered that they could do this, click 1, click 2. We should have, no, it should be, I have a longer list on a slide here. I don't know why it's not showing up here. But anyway, there are tribes that include the Absentee Shawnee, the Alabama Coasarte, the Anadarko, the Caddo, the Catawba, of course the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, and the Choctaw have already been mentioned, the Comanche, the Delaware, the Eastern Shawnee, the Hanai, the Kichai, the Kalagi, the Montagana, the Mississauga, the Planatanshaw, the Quapaw, the Seminole. I knew one Quapaw man when I was out in Oklahoma. He had an unusual hobby. He collected mustard. I don't know how many different meats he tried it on, but you go to his house, he had mustard. That's what I remember from him. The Seneca Cayuga, which in the 1830s, under the Indian Removal Act, by the United States government, were made into one tribe. At one time, they were separate tribes under the Iroquois Confederacy. The Conestoga Erie, the Eastern Shawnee, the Tawakoni, the Tafeviokoko, the United Kiowa, which were a branch of the Cherokee people, and the Wichita. The legacy of the doctrine of discovery, let's go to, see if we can find that slide up here. The legacy of the doctrine of discovery, of course, were the continued removals of people, the creation of the Indian Territory, which was supposed to have been reserved for those tribes. You can see how good that was in 1907 when that was made into a state. And I will say that Oklahoma could have come in as two separate states. The tribes of eastern Oklahoma petitioned the government when statehood was being discussed in the early 1900s to be admitted as a separate state, as the state of Sequoia. But it was not in the interests, commercial interests, that wanted control of the state to have two separate states. Southeastern Oklahoma has coal. It was terribly important. Central eastern Oklahoma has woods and forests. It isn't all prairie. And they wanted one state and one state government so that they could control those areas. There was the establishment of the reservation system in the late 19th century. The Indian Wars of the 19th century, which continued up until 1891 and ended with the massacre at Wounded Knee. The outlawed native religions, dances, and languages. Part of the process of assimilation was to get the children, force the children to attend these boarding schools where they could only speak English, only dress in Western culture, could be punished for singing and dancing and talking in their own family language. There's the Dawes Severalty Act, which began in 1888 under Dawes, Henry Dawes, senator from Massachusetts, who knew nothing about native life, said that we need to encourage them to live more like white people. And the Dawes Severalty Act felt its first impact in Oklahoma, of course, and what it did is it divided Indian lands up into allotments, and allotments would either go to Indian families, and non-aligned allotments then could be sold off to white settlers. This is why Oklahoma now has numerous non-native settlements in the middle of what should be Indian territory. And what Dawes did not seem to care about was like one of the first things the Cherokee did within 10 years of arriving in Oklahoma was to build their first college, which is now Northeastern State University. These were not a primitive people. And we have the Snyder Act of 1924. Snyder, said, you know, what the problem is that under the 14th Amendment, there's a clause in there that says anybody that's born within the United States is a United States citizen. But we're not recognizing American Indians, native peoples, as American citizens, and none of them are permitted to vote. So in 1924, Native Americans were enfranchised. And yet it took until the 1960s until every state in the United States recognized that the natives within its own state had the same rights to vote as non-natives. It's a long process. The Wheeler-Howard Reorganization Act ended the Dawes policy of carving up these Indian lands into allotments, recognized that there was a lot of poverty that was showing up in native lands that wasn't there before, and said we need to return some level of sovereignty to these tribes. But it didn't last terribly long, because another Congress came in and passed what were called the termination policies, which was to phase tribes out of existence as legal entities. And there were about 5 tribes in the United States that lost their designation as official tribes. So in the United States, we have this policy, this law, where tribes to be recognized by the federal government, one, have to establish that through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and then by an act of Congress. And an act of Congress could revoke the standing of a tribe. Now imagine if we were to say to France, if we had a disagreement with France, we don't agree with you with your trade policies, so we are going to vote you out of existence as a legal entity. Be a little awkward, wouldn't it? But we do this to the tribes, which technically are nations. And then we get down to the 1970s, a decade of reform with more legislation than I can list here. But finally, we return more sovereignty to the tribes. We end the termination policies. An unusual, well, depends on where you stand, I suppose, politically, an unusual person who actually advocated for tribal sovereignty was Richard Nixon. Maybe one of the few good things he did. But, and what that did is that allowed tribes to elect their own governments. And so tribes have different forms of government. Tribal lands were recognized as being with an asterisk on it under tribal control, and I'll explain that in a moment. Tribal health care took a leap forward. Tribal education took a leap forward. The Protection Act that protects native graves and artifacts became federal policy. So if you're out walking and you happen to find something on the ground that probably has some kind of tribal connection, you can't just go and take it home. You have to have permission from the local tribe to take that, because it technically belongs to them. So these reforms came out of that. Oh, and the bingo halls and casinos. See, we say that these tribes are sovereign, but they can't tax. But they're allowed to provide services for the people: health care, all education and stuff like that. What are you going to fund it? Turns out the casinos are one way to do it. If you're a Native American in the United States, you belong to the only ethnic group in which you need to carry proof of your ethnicity. On the left, you'll see a sample of a tribal card. Looks a lot like a driver's license, and many tribes offer separate driver's licenses as well. And on the right, you see what is called a certificate of degree of Indian blood. And if you're an Italian American, German American, you don't need to go and carry an ID to say this is my heritage. But if you don't carry one or both of these, even if your family line is strongly Native, you can't belong to a tribe. You can't be awarded benefits that the federal government may award you in terms of health care. And there is a treaty by which the United States government is obligated to provide health care on many of the reservations. I said there was an asterisk. Many of the Indian lands, and what were Indian lands is a complicated legacy in itself, nowhere more complicated than in Oklahoma. Already the allotment system has broken up what were large reservations, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw out there. And you've got non-native communities, non-native owners right in the midst, many of them living quite oblivious to the Indian land that surrounds them. In other parts of the country, that land is held in reserve for the tribe by the federal government, which means the federal government can revoke that trust at any time, and has. Most recent was the Bears Ears National Monument out west in Wyoming. And the Obama administration actually awarded more land to the tribes out there. The Trump administration revoked much of that trust, land trust, to hand it over to commercial development. This has happened time and again to tribes in the United States. All of this is a legacy of the doctrine of discovery. There are many social issues that are endemic, particularly to Native communities in the United States and in Canada. One of the movements in both Canada and the United States is what's called the Murdered, Missing, and Indigenous Women movement. This is because on reservation lands, many of them which are remote from other communities, is also too remote to monitor. And people have moved in and have abducted Native women, and they have been sold into the trafficking industry, which is still a problem in the United States. And so the Murdered, Missing, and Indigenous Women movement is pushing for tighter legislation and for more cooperation from federal and state authorities in confronting human traffickers on their lands. And it's still a struggle, because the states will say, well, if you're a sovereign nation, you take care of it, which depends on the state government. Because in Oklahoma state government has been saying for decades, we can come in on Indian land and arrest anybody for a crime that committed a crime. And the tribe said, if they commit a crime on our land, we want first shot with our tribal police to arrest them and try them in a tribal court, whether that person's a native or not. And this led to McGirt versus the state of Oklahoma in the Supreme Court in 2020. Now Oklahoma is countersuing in the Supreme Court. And I don't know if it's going to be heard this session or not, but it's a shuttlecock that keeps going back and forth. This is part of the legacy of discovery. And so, in closing, let me summarize the struggle. The ADSD, that's how you pronounce that, and if you look on the extreme left, you see how it's spelled in Cherokee, the struggle. They struggle for recognition, and I may talk about this if I'm given the opportunity at a later time, when I also talk about mascots and stereotypes, to be recognized for who they are, not for who we think they are. for equitable health care. You can go into some clinics operated by the United States government under the Indian Health Service. I can remember going into one when I was living and working in Oklahoma back in the 1990s, and I thought I had walked into a doctor's office from 1965. That's how far behind, because of the funding. It's always behind. And the struggle to preserve their languages and cultural identity. It doesn't mean that they're saying we want to be so separate we cannot interact with the society around us. We want to also preserve who we are. We want our children to remember where they came from. To preserve natural resources. This is, if many of you followed just several years ago, the struggle over water and the water protectors in South Dakota. And when the oil industry wanted to run a pipeline across the waters of the Standing Rock Reservation, and the people said, we don't want oil running across our source of water, led to a nationwide protest. This is an example. Sovereignty over their own legal affairs, which is an ongoing struggle. Education, raising the education level in many Native communities. The Cherokee Nation has been very aggressive in this and trying to get more of its young people to finish high school and to attend college. And of course, Northeastern State University is right in the heart of the Cherokee Nation. It's located in Tahlequah, which is also the capital of the Cherokee Nation. Yes, they have a capital. And combating poverty. Sorry, the misspelling there. Combating poverty. The poorest communities in the United States are on the reservations in South Dakota, where people live in conditions sometimes that are worse than you see in parts of the developing world. And substance abuse is a problem. In places where you have endemic poverty, of course, addictions are not far behind. Very often people turn towards substance abuse to escape their own misery. Across from there are 2 or 3 reservations on the southern side of South Dakota, bordering with Nebraska. And across the state line, Nebraska has been a thriving alcohol and substance market, preying on unemployed members of those reservations. The reservations have been struggling to get these businesses shut down. And, as I mentioned, competing in human trafficking. And so this is where we are. This is the legacy of the doctrine of discovery. This is particularly how we've experienced it in North America. In Canada, they have their own struggles. You can go and today, and if you want just an example, in Canada, you can take ferries along from Vancouver Island and up along the British Columbia coast, and they'll take it to these scenic First Nation sites with their totem poles and carvings. But 140 years ago, Canada tried to outlaw those very same carvings in their own bid to assimilate their people. Their legacy of the boarding schools is as horrific as the United States legacy of boarding schools. Just a to remind us where we've been. The boarding schools are just a Western phenomenon. Children were sent to boarding schools intentionally far from their home tribes. One of the largest was Carlisle in Pennsylvania. But there are boarding schools here in Ohio. At one time, there was a small boarding school near Republic. The building is gone, the grounds are gone. The cemetery is still there. Why should a school have a cemetery? But many times children died in these schools, never seen their families of origin again. Often they died from abuse and starvation, sometimes just from the cultural shock. We have a lot of work to do. I share these things not to instill guilt, but I hope to make us aware that we are here on Indian land, technically. Even though in Ohio we have no officially recognized tribe anymore, no officially recognized tribal land anymore, even though the Shawnee were very strong in the southern part of the state, the Wyandot here in northwest Ohio, along with the Seneca. But because we do not always interact with the native community in our part of Ohio, doesn't mean that we need to forget who they are. Not were, are. And to recognize that the struggle goes on. To conclude the Spanish woman's story, she was my grandmother. And I, at this time, thank you for letting me speak to you. There's a step here.
That's all right. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you.
Just fine. Thank you. Very insightful. Thank you. Very informative. Learned a lot. Thank you. We're going to pass our offertory basket at this time. If you're a visitor, we welcome you to donate cash or via the PayPal link using the QR code in the basket. Please note that what predominantly supports MVUUC are annual pledges by our members or friends. The yellow cards are located in the pockets on the back of the chairs and are used to indicate this support and can be placed in the offertory basket. We encourage anybody who believes in our mission here to consider becoming a member and to pledge support. Please email news@mvuuc.org if you are interested in learning about the benefits of being a member and how to pledge. What's that? Maybe let's go right on to Joy. Yeah. So now we're going to go on to our sharing of joys, concerns, and milestones. I guess we need to stop recording at this time. Many faith communities. Join me in reading the words for extinguishing our chalice today by Ma Teresa Tet Gustillo Gallardo. Care to begin? May we respond better to risk and dangers with a beloved community who can be counted on as a woven basket that encompasses the gifts for protection, for honor, for ceremony, and for expressions of interconnectedness. May we prevail in our intentions to make a gift of the world to the next generation of beings, living and non-living, that help it all come together for good. Thank you. Now is the time for announcements. Does anyone have any announcements today they would like to share? Go ahead. Sure. Yeah. Go ahead. Sure.
I had wanted to let you all know about the trunk or treat coming up the Sunday before Halloween. For details on that, just to save time, you could just read about the details on the bulletin board over the coffee maker. But I do want that to be on your calendars. Bring your cars with candy and kids, and it'll be a really good time.
And wear costumes and all that. Yeah, all that. It's all on the flyer.
I just have a quickie. I don't know if you all caught what Phil said at the end of his talk, but that the Spanish woman of London was his grandmother. So I wanted to make sure you understood that connection. I thought that was very important.
Hi, I have one announcement from Susan, who's attending through Zoom, and she said that she's going to be offering Zoom yoga this week, Wednesday evening at 6 p.m. So contact Susan if you're interested in joining. Last time Susan did Zoom yoga, I was there regularly, and it was a really good time. She's a great teacher, so I highly endorse it. The second announcement is from me. Anti-racism reading group is going to start up. We're going to read a book called Mistakes and Miracles, Congregations on the Road to Multiculturalism. I haven't heard from anybody yet, which is unusual. Maybe it's because I haven't brought the book to show you all, but please look in the newsletter for the announcement about the anti-racism reading group, and contact me at the email address in the newsletter if you're interested in joining. Thank you.
Anyone else? All right. We invite, of course, after our closing song is coming up, we invite everyone who's here to stay for any coffee afterwards. It's always a great time to have a little chance to converse with each other before we head home. Our closing song for today is going to be hymn 414, As We Leave This Friendly Place. You can find the words and music in your gray hymnal. For our Zoom attendees, the lyrics are posted in the Zoom chat box.
If it helps you, it's in your books. It's almost the last one, 414. I'll play it slowly once, though, anyway, so that we can just hear how it goes. We haven't done this one before, at least I have not while I've been here. So one time around with the piano, and then it's very short.